This is episode 40 of the Shameproof Your Life podcast, the one where I talk about my experience with theft. I'm your host and life coach, Danita Bremer. Have you ever received a prompting that you ignored for a long time, like 17 years? This podcast is that for me. I'm telling my stories, I'm learning from my past, and I'm inviting you along for the ride. My intention is that you will find hope, relief, and understanding of yourself by listening to my stories. Okay, you guys, can you believe this is 40 episodes? I know it's not a whole year, it's not like a normal benchmark, but for some reason, it feels very monumental to me. It feels like a big deal. It feels like, wow, I have produced a podcast episode 40 weeks in a row and a couple extras, not to mention. I wanted to give you a little warning that actually, for the last several weeks, maybe the last couple of months, even, I have been thinking about the direction of this podcast and considering some new ideas. If you can't tell, it's not that I'm starting to run out of stories. It feels like I'm starting to run out of stories that are really meaningful, um, that are like, this is what happened kind of stories. I have tons more things to share, but they're not always a story from my life. So, just a little bit of fair warning that I am shooting for 12 more episodes where I tell a story from my life. And then after that, it might change a little bit. It's still going to be me talking and teaching and basing everything off of my own experience, but it will most likely be a little bit more about life coaching concepts and what I'm going through right now that I think would be helpful for all of you. And also, I'm still going to encourage you to go out and tell your stories. I firmly believe that when we listen to each other and when we tell our stories, we can change the world. Like, imagine if everybody listened to everybody else's stories, how much empathy and love and compassion would be put into the world, and what a different world that would be, right? All right. So last night I was thinking about what I wanted to say today on the podcast, and my brain was just scanning my life and thinking about all of the experiences that relate to shame or guilt or insecurity or inadequacy. And I realized that I haven't told you the story of when I thieved something, which is actually kind of amazing because it's kind of a big deal to me. I don't know, this is a story that has shaped who I am, I think. And it happened when I was probably about 4 years old. We were still living in California. We had not moved to Washington yet, which happened right before I turned 6. And I remember I was at I think it was a gas station or a convenience store with both of my parents. And I was just tall enough that the height of the checkout counter was like right at my nose. It was taller than my mouth, but shorter just barely than my eyeballs. And I saw this little box of chocolates on the counter, like those impulse buys, all the things that they just have there sitting on the counter for last second purchases. I kind of think that it might have been around Easter time because there were these little footballs wrapped in foil and they looked like footballs that remind me of Easter candy. So, kind of an egg shaped, but the foil around the chocolate looked like a football. And I asked my mom if I could have one. They were probably honestly like 5 or 10 cents. And she said no. So I asked my dad if I could have one, and he said no. And they were busy, checking out whatever we were buying there. And I picked one up like I was just going to look at it, I just want to look so innocent, right? And I decided to put it in my pocket and nobody noticed. And so we walked out of the store and I had stolen a piece of candy, a piece of chocolate. And I totally am a chocoholic. I love chocolate. I don't eat it very much anymore because my body doesn't really like it. And I tend to get migraines when I eat chocolate. But I was only 4 and chocolate was a big part of my diet, of course. And um, I remember walking out of the store and feeling so much guilt. Like it just washed over me. It was probably a minute or 2 after we left the store and I just felt so much guilt that I was kind of dawdling behind my parents as we're walking home and I felt so guilty that I took that chocolate out of my pocket and I threw it in the bushes. I didn't even eat it, you guys. Didn't even eat it. I did not tell my parents about that for a long time. I think eventually, years later, I told them and they were like, "What? You stole candy?" But they didn't make that big of a deal. They were kind of like, "Well, yeah, you were a little kid. You wanted this chocolate. Makes sense. We've all done it," kind of thing. And what I learned, I've told that story quite a few times in different settings, but it's usually in the context of like when you feel really guilty and then what do you do about that? And you want to like get away from the guilt, like throw the candy in the bushes, right? And but more recently, I've been doing some more work on myself and learning about my strengths and just kind of who I am by default. I'm a huge personality nerd. I love Myers Briggs and Enneagram. And recently I got into Simon Sinek's Find Your Why and, things like that. Gretchen Rubin's Four Tendencies. I just love all those kinds of things. And as I've been doing this work and going really deep and alongside of the coaching that I do, and also I just hired a trauma coach to help me process some of the traumas and life events that I have experienced. And you guys, it's like breaking me open and I'm seeing things, I'm making connections in ways that I have never made before. And this is why I so encourage you to tell your stories, to speak up and to air out all the things that you are guilty or ashamed or sad or joyful. Like it doesn't matter. It can be negative or positive to just talk about what you feel and why you feel it. And at least for me, and I know not everyone is like this, but I am very much a verbal processor. I was talking to my husband about this last night about how he's an engineer, he's very analytical, and he kind of comes to a conclusion about something and then we'll talk about it. But I don't come to the conclusion before I talk about the thing, whatever the thing is. I have to talk about it in order to come to the conclusion. So I'm a verbal processor and just doing this podcast and sharing with you all these random stories from my life. Some are more tender than others. I've shared really hard, difficult things. I've shared moments of joy. Like it's been all over the place. I do notice that I tend to talk more about early childhood than I do about teenager stuff or young adult stuff. But I think the reason for that is that I don't remember teenager, like my teen years and my young adult years as much. I was like super focused on school and graduating and getting to college. And I feel like I wasn't as present. And my opinion is that when we're very present is when we create those memories, along with kind of the trauma and things that I think my mind disassociated from. But I have a lot more vivid memories from kind of earlier childhood, like before age 10. And it's probably no coincidence that some of the most difficult things happened after age 10 or around, age 10, 11 is when some of the more difficult things happened. So all that to say that this podcast and telling my stories and the other work that I've been doing has helped me to make connections and to understand myself in a new and deeper way. So recently, I know this about me that I have really high moral standards. If you know the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 1, wing 2. And Enneagram ones are like, they have this very high morality that if they're not careful, they try to push on to others. And I totally have done that my whole life. With coaching, I've had a lot more awareness and I can kind of separate my values, my thoughts, my feelings from what I think other people should do. And I very much lean into this idea that everyone has their own journey. And who am I to say what you should or shouldn't do, even if I think it's bad or negative? So in recent years, I've been able to kind of stop putting my morals on to other people and um, using it as like a negative. But I still find that I think things like everyone should recycle. Like, why are we not all taking care of the earth? It is the right thing to do. We should just all do it. If I find out that somebody doesn't recycle, like in fact, one of my very best friends doesn't recycle, totally fine. I don't think anything differently of her. I totally love her and her family, but I think people should do it, right? So I still have these moral standards and I'm careful about how I characterize them or when I use the word should or shouldn't, because I don't want other people to feel like they have to, live by the standards that I have because they are very high. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to share with you, and I realized I hadn't shared this story about stealing the chocolate from the convenience store, it just like my mind just saw it in a new way. I was like, oh, I've had this kind of high moral standard basically since infancy. I think it's just kind of how I came. I think I have a very strong moral compass. And something else somewhat related is that most children, young children, do not go against what their parents want for them. Their parents are like, you know, can do no evil. They're the standard for them. They're the heroes, that kind of thing. This is how we are wired to be because our parents are who take care of us and they're our safety. So anything our parents say or do is like truth and goodness, right? But from a very young age, I had this intuitive understanding that my parents did not have high morals. And I mean, that's not to say they didn't have any morals. My dad definitely taught me to like try to not borrow money, but if you have to borrow money, to pay it off as soon as possible. My mom taught me that, don't make fun of people and everyone's different and unique and, don't be a bully and don't make fun of people. So they had their own things that they really wanted to impart, but then on the other hand, they were, drinking alcohol and smoking weed and drugs and selling drugs, like illegal drugs. And so eh, you kind of, I don't know, you question that, right? But even from a young child, I kind of had this intuitive knowing that my parents didn't have super high morals and that I wanted high morals. That's just how I came. I used to not want to miss any school. And my parents would be like, come on, we're going to go have fun. We're going to go to an amusement park and we want to leave a day early, blah, blah, blah. Nope. I have to be at school. I need to be at school. And they would, make fun of me and come on, you can miss a day every once in a while. No, nope, nope, nope. So reflecting on this story just made me realize how I already basically from a very, very early age had this very strong moral compass. And I also think something about being emotionally sensitive plays a role there. I have another little story about, I remember this time I must have been 3 or 4 years old, and I thought I was stealing some sugar out of the kitchen, but it ended up being salt. But all I remember is that I had this little pile of white crystal, food. Thankfully, it wasn't any kind of drugs or anything, and I had it in the palm of my hand, and I went underneath. We had a piano and a piano bench, and I hid, quote unquote, hid under the piano bench. Now, if you know, piano benches can't really hide under them. It's pretty easy to like see somebody kneeling under a piano bench. But I thought I was hidden, which makes me think I was maybe even younger than 4, like maybe 2 or 3. And I started licking the white crystal powder out of my hand, and I thought it was going to be sugar, and it was salt. And so I thought I was hiding. And so I started coughing, and I was trying to keep my cough quiet because I didn't want to be found. Um, so even from really, really young age, I, obviously I wasn't perfect because here I am stealing salt, thinking it's sugar, and stealing chocolate from the convenience store. But I naturally, like, this is what our brains naturally do when we realize we've done something wrong, is we want to hide, right? And so then that that can lead to like blaming ourselves, which a client session that I had yesterday made me realize that this might be a good thing to bring up on the podcast, that when you're a young child and you hold your parents in high esteem, your world is very small. Like, you are the center of your world, and then there's your parents and maybe siblings. But if something goes wrong, it's very natural and normal for you to blame yourself and for you to feel that shame, because it can't be your parents, right? They're like, they're grown-ups and they know things, and they're almost perfect, right? From a very young child's point of view, the parents have a lot more knowledge and understanding, and they must, be nearly perfect. And so who else could it be? What else could it be? Well, then it has to be me, right? That's wrong or whatever. And that's a really normal response. It's a response that your brain gives you in order to protect you. Because if it's you, then you can change it. You can do something about it, right? But what happens is, if we have these repeated experiences where we blame ourselves, then it becomes kind of a superhighway in your brain. Hold on. And you never get off the superhighway. And so you grow, and you just keep assuming that that same thing that as a very young kid you were assuming is still true, when it very well may not be true. Right. And so I was talking about this with a client, and we were realizing that her brain has these patterns of, well, it must be me because, and where did that come from? It probably came from, when she was really young. And then she said, and actually, from a really young age, my parents told me it was my fault. So, in my personal experience, my parents never told me, you're wrong or you're bad or whatever, things like that. It was just kind of a natural response that I had. She had that natural response, my client. And also, her parents told her she was bad and wrong and it was her fault. And so, of course, that would be reinforced in her mind, right? Very strong pattern. And so now she's approaching 50 years old, and now she's trying to untangle that wiring in her brain, where she automatically thinks it's her fault, because not everything is her fault. And she, sometimes acts out where she'll, try to prove that it's not, and things like that. And it just causes more trouble. And so we're coaching around leaning into this idea that it might not even be about you. It's normally about the other person or whatever, right? And Yeah, and I'm just going to bring this full circle by kind of reflecting on this story about how I stole this piece of candy and I just felt so much guilt. I intuitively in my soul knew that that was a wrong thing. Now, I don't remember my parents saying, we don't steal things, we don't take things without pain, but they probably did, right? I probably had some kind of conscious learning about stealing and theft. But I mean, that's pretty young. That's a pretty young age for about, I think I was like 3 or 4 years old. Um, so they may not have, right? And I kind of think, even if I had some conscious teaching or learning about it, it was more just an intuitive knowing. And that is what I kind of want to leave you with today is that you intuitively know things that are right and wrong. And you learn things consciously from your parents, from culture, from TV, radio, like all the places where we learn, school, we learn, right from wrong. But also our bodies kind of already know, right? I just think that there are certain things that we intuitively know. I think that's what I have for you today. That's enough for now. And so are you. Just got to throw my sign off in there. It's my signature. And yeah, I just really believe that if you tell your stories and you listen to other people's stories, you will change the world. Is it really that simple? I don't know, but I think it is. And I'm acting on it. So I'm offering free listening sessions. I'm calling them listening sessions. There's a link in the show notes. And there's a link to my weekly newsletter if you want to sign up for more thoughts from me. Take me up on it. I'm not selling you anything. I'm not going to coach you unless you want me to, right? But I think that if I just sit and listen to your story and you feel heard and seen, honestly, that can be the start to a better world. Until next time, go be you and follow the spirit.